Welcome to Hey Listen, where we discuss faith, leadership, and the mission of the church. We're so glad you've joined us. Now to today's episode. All right, today we are talking revival and how revival doesn't have to be in stadiums and full of lights and all of the bling with it, but revival comes in the quiet of our heart. And I'm really excited about this conversation.
Me too. I think it's something, if there was one subject that has dominated my mind, I think about it every day. As it relates to the church and the work of the church, it is, what is revival? One, we want to try to define that, but honestly, beyond the thinking through it, it's something I want to experience. When you read church history, you realize that the majority of church history is not revival. And there are these wonderful fireworks that we see throughout the last 2,000 years, just very brief, bright moments where the Spirit of God works in a way that goes beyond any description. And
Right.
I think it's important for us as we start this conversation to say that even if we talk about some revivals that are historical, one of the big problems we have is we try to define revival and expect it to occur the same way again. And I think that's the one thing that is consistent is the inconsistency, that every revival is different.
Yeah.
It hits in a different way. Now, one common thing we see is that it often happens among our young people. So children's minister, this is good for you. You get to be, I think, potentially on the front edge of any revival because it's kids and youth typically that catch fire, and then that has this effect on the whole church all the way up to, us old gray-headed folks. But it usually does start with kids, so that's neat.
Absolutely. And it is exciting. And, where we may not be seeing revival and, the sense of what we're going to be talking about, but on a fairly regular basis, we are seeing kids come to Christ. And that is so exciting. If it's, even just we have this coming week, we have a class for kids asking faith questions. But then, every few months we have a starting point class where we're, getting them ready for baptism and hearing their little testimonies. I feel like I get a little sense of revival regularly, but that may not feel true for everyone in church, like as a big C, or just here at Ridgecrest even.
Yeah, I think so. And we have a tendency sometimes to miss the day of small things, as the prophet put it. Every time someone receives Christ and every time we see a baptism in church, that is revival.
Yes.
There is an element of that. But I also think it's perfectly okay for us to long to cry for more. I mean, I think it's not greedy to want more of the Spirit in your life. It's not greedy to want to see the Spirit move in a more tangible way. Jesus is always in a worship service, but I've been really thinking about this week. I've talked with our shepherding team some, and I've had conversations. I want people to come to Ridgecrest, and I don't want them to think, oh, we have a great children's ministry, and that's the first thing, or, oh, I love the sermon, or, oh, I love the music. I'm just picking a couple specific things there. But wouldn't it be great if people would come to a service, whether here or any other evangelical church, and say, I met with Jesus today. He was there.
Right.
So in the most broad way possible, can we not define revival, not just as the Spirit was there, but more specifically, Jesus. Jesus was there.
Absolutely.
We felt his presence. And I would just challenge people who are listening. I mean, you can say maybe I hope people would say, oh yeah, every Sunday, but I wonder, I do, how many of the average folks that come to church on a given Sunday, let's say they've been to Sunday service 4 weeks in a row, would say, when's the last time you really walked out of church and felt like Jesus was there?
Yeah. And we know he's there.
He is.
But oftentimes our heart may not actually be there.
So revival isn't so much Jesus showing up, it's the church realizing that he's already there.
Right. Yes.
It's not a complicated thing. And the last few years I've read quite a bit on the great revivals because I mean it, Kayla. My heart is hungry for that. Like I really want to see God move. And one of the things that we learn is, again, to be humble, that we have to approach this subject knowing that, one, what God has done in the past is a wonderful thing, but what he may do moving forward is something completely different. And so we don't want to try to manufacture it. And that's another thing, Kayla, we really have got to hit hard on here.
Yes.
Is one of the books that we're going to recommend is Revival and Revivalism by Ian Murray. I think he's the most powerful writer on this subject in the last 50 years. And he does a great job of distinguishing between revivalism, which is man-made, which is maybe some of the things that you and I, if we went to revival services when we were younger, you know, where you have a guest speaker who's an evangelist, and you expect certain kinds of music and certain kinds of activity. Ian Murray would say, be careful, because that might be revivalism, where we're trying to manufacture something. Sometimes you'll go to a service, and rarely a Baptist, because we rarely have this much enthusiasm, sadly, but you'll go to a more charismatic context, and you can tell, like, there is one very important part of what they're trying to do is to try to get the emotional heat up, right? They're trying to get the energy up. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, I'm kind of joking and moaning. I long for Baptists to have more energetic worship. I mean that with all my heart. But you can tell sometimes that maybe we're trying too hard, you know? And I just want to warn against that. That's not what we're talking about here.
Right.
Kayla, I'll say this. I mean, when we look at the history of evangelism and revival, almost in every great revival, there was a huge camp of people that rose up in the church against it. So in the First Great Awakening in America, Jonathan Edwards, and you know, he saw this great movement of God, and yet there were people who were accusing them of being, I think the language of the day was enthusiasts. Okay, oh, that's just enthusiasm. And so today we might say, oh, they're just, you know, it's the fog machines and it's the speaking in tongues. And, you know, I can remember when I was a kid, someone went to a conference, and I won't tell you who it was, but it was a big singer at the time who's charismatic. And they had a primer, a little teaching session before the concert on how to speak in tongues.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so that may be revivalism, okay? Where you're trying to like force the issue. Like, we're so hungry for revival, Kayla. We sometimes I think we may force the issue.
Yes. And, you know, we try to be super cautious of that, specifically in kids ministry too, even with things like Vacation Bible School or camp, where we want to see kids come to Christ, but we have to be so intentional to have personal conversations. You know, long are gone the days of, you know, raise your hand and pray with me, because we want to make sure that kids know what they're doing, that it's a true, you know, salvation experience, and we can walk them through that. And then it's also easier if they start questioning that. You know, several episodes back, we talked about doubting your salvation and all of that. Like, when those conversations happen intentionally, you know, we can help guide, you know, that, remember, this is, you know, from our perspective, this is what we saw in you, and that's exciting. But, you know, I would love to see 30 kids come to Christ at Bible school, like you see in some places. But if we have 3 kids come to Christ and we have intentional conversations, that's exciting.
And I don't know, I hear what you're saying. I remember very, very clearly at Vacation Bible School, at church camp, close your eyes, bow your head, raise your hand. And you knew that a lot of people were caught up in the moment, right? I mean, with all your friends are there. There's all these things going on. It's emotionally charged. And you worry that maybe some of that might not be real, but I want us to be careful to not go the other direction, right?
I agree.
And not to be, I think there's moments there where we should be more aggressive in calling people to faith and calling people away from their sins. And so over the years, some of my training made me a little skeptical of those evangelistic practices. As you study with the Presbyterians, I guarantee you're going to get somewhat skeptical of those evangelical practices that are specifically Baptist and charismatic. But I think my Presbyterian brothers maybe push me the wrong direction too much, a little bit, although they're great students of revival, and some of the best writing done is from the Presbyterian side of things. But I think we need to also realize that it's okay, like don't hesitate to call people to Christ. If there are 30, that doesn't mean that you were overly emotional or you did something wrong. What if it was just the Spirit of God showed up?
Sure. And we gave them the opportunity to respond. That was something I even struggled with a little bit on our most recent mission trip. I've struggled with it at camp. We say things from the stage or from, a teaching setting, and then say, come and find us if you're ready to do this. But then we don't always give an opportunity to actually do that. And so, maybe it is that we give a response time. I'm thinking specifically kids ministry, but we're intentional to follow up with those conversations. And I think that's where, the caution can stay in there with kids.
I'm convinced. Our executive pastor, Wayne Barron, he often talks about discipleship and evangelism as the opposite sides of the same coin, that if we are really doing discipleship well, it will dovetail into evangelism. Yes. And our evangelism will see people come to know Christ, which then turns the coin again, and we're back to discipleship. And those two things work hand in hand. And the church, when it gets out of balance, and I think when I was growing up, I think the balance was on the side of evangelism. When in the 70s and 80s, and this is where it gets funny, we could have a long conversation about when was the last great revival.
Sure.
And I've been saying for the last 20 years, my reading of history would say the early 20th century in the Welsh revival, which is not well known today, but I if you go read about it just a little bit, if you just ask the robot on your computer to tell you about the Welsh revival, it was right before the World War I era. And it was a movement that just overtook a whole part of Britain, and a lot of young people came to know the Lord. And sadly, a lot of those young men died in the trenches of World War I. Funny, not funny at all, but sad in the same way. Actually, is the Second Great Awakening that happened in the 1850s. So many of those young men died in the Civil War.
Okay.
And so when we look at it in the larger historical context, often these great revivals precede some pretty big geopolitical events.
Yeah.
But I think it's important for us to just rest in the fact that these things are way beyond us, right? That God is so much bigger. And Ian Murray, again, another book, Pentecost Today, a book that I would say is a really good book to read about like revivals today. He says this: I worship a God. Actually, Charles Spurgeon said this. He said, I worship a God I never expect to comprehend. And I think when it comes to revival, we need to remember that. And I feel like, again, going back to growing up, I was at the very end of what was known as the Jesus movement. The people who were my pastors and youth leaders had come to faith and come to age in the 70s. And so the Welsh revival is what I was saying. So I was having a conversation with a church historian at Midwestern 2 or 3 years ago. I was doing some research there on a project, and so I was in their library, and the people at Midwestern were very kind. They gave me my own spot to research and let me spend some time there. And so I just happened upon a guy that I knew from the past. I knew he was a church historian, and I asked him this question. And he agreed that the Welsh revival certainly is a candidate, but he made a compelling argument that the Jesus movement, and I think there was a movie that's come out recently about that.
Yes.
Oh, what was that? We'll have to figure that out, Kobe. It was a movie came out a couple years ago. It had Kelsey Grammer in it. The Jesus Revolution. There we go. That movie is awesome, by the way. I'm telling you, that is a great movie that will help you understand that movement that started out in California. But he would argue, this church historian argued with me that was the last great revival.
Okay.
And the more I talk to people like of my dad's generation, so many people were called to the ministry during that time. A couple of our retired missionaries that attend here trace their conversion to that movement.
Interesting. Okay.
So the more I dig, the more I realize that maybe the last revival. So that makes sense. So like I told you, when I was a young man, I was still feeling the last waves of that revival and evangelism. And there were some great evangelists in those days who would come that were making the circuit. and they were just still anointed. And I can remember that I was saved at a revival service from a Missouri revivalist, revival guy named Fred Durkee was his name. And he was a powerful preacher. He was gifted as an evangelist. But then my generation and on into yours, I think those years have been more geared. We've not seen as much evangelism and revival as a focus. We've seen more of a discipleship focus.
Absolutely.
So I think that we've seen more of that. So if we go like 20 to 40 years in terms of a couple generations, I think we're primed for a revival.
Absolutely.
I think we're ready for one.
So thinking back to was it Asbury that we saw that, a lot of people were saying, this is a big revival, and obviously God was at work in that. But I think, did we see true growth from that? And we were talking before, like, I'm a super fun person. I'm like bubbly, all the things, but I actually am very skeptical. And I have had a hard time seeing that. Maybe I saw it for what it was, but maybe I didn't give it enough credit.
I think this is one of those things that only in about 20 or 30 years will we know. There's a famous story told about a Western diplomat that was in China. And just out of curiosity, he asked a Chinese leader, "What do you think about the French Revolution?" And this just happened like 20 years ago. And he goes, "It's too early to tell." The French Revolution happened in 1789. So I think that we as modern church people and modern people living in our moment right now, we have a tendency to say, oh yeah, like if we were close to that particular revival, we'd say that was a big deal. But I think we need to see how time goes. I don't know that we could say the Jesus movement, the Jesus revival of the 70s. I'm thinking just now we're far enough away from it to say either yes or no.
Okay.
And I think it's yes. I really do. So I don't want to weigh in on that. I was really, really hopeful that would catch fire. And I have some friends in ministry that think that there's still some residual from that, and maybe so. But the Charlie Kirk thing that happened, his strong stance for faith. Now, I know everybody wants to think about when we watch the news about that, it's only about his politics.
Right.
But I'm more and more fascinated with his faith.
Yeah.
Like he was saying some pretty bold things about Christ in his last years on this earth. And I think that even that in maybe 20 years. So people are saying, "Oh, do you think this is the something that might cause a revival amongst that generation?" What is it, Generation Z or whatever they're calling it these days? Maybe, but I think I don't want to talk about Asbury specifically or Charlie Kirk specifically because we're living in that right now.
That makes sense.
What I would say is this: if my hunch is correct, and it's just a hunch, that the Jesus movement was in fact a revival, a position that I've just kind of adopted in the last few years. And let's say we've had about 40 years where we've been in an age of discipleship. Kayla, I am sensing something from those young people that are coming out of our student ministry and going into the college ministry. There is a hunger for God that's fresh.
I agree.
I've not seen a generation, and we were in a prayer meeting this morning, and a couple of us were talking. One of the reasons why I think that this generation is primed for revival is because I think this generation has been discipled better than any generation in the last 100 years. I am just convinced that my son's age, so he's 21, and I see up until, we've got some young men in our church that are in their mid-20s right now. There is something going on in them. They are built different.
I agree. And
they're built different.
We were just talking about age. I'm not that much ahead of them, but in reality, I am about 15 years ahead of that. And it is different from my upbringing. I had an amazing upbringing. My parents pointed us to Jesus. We had awesome Sunday school teachers and, youth leaders, but it was different. We heard lots of true things from the Bible, but I think there was a lack of discipleship.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't until I was a young mom and had someone come beside me and say, let's dive into this together. Let me teach you how to really study the word, and then taught me how to lead someone else through discipleship as well.
So it's interesting, again, I think when you and I are having a conversation like this, I think just the fact that we, in a talk about revival, have spent, 6 or 7 minutes talking about discipleship. Why? Because it is something that's a more logical, more practical, more knowable variable.
Sure.
It's a variable. Discipleship is different from place to place. It's not, the beauty of the Christian faith is that we can use the word discipleship, but we know that there's gradients of that. There's variations of that. There's deeper discipleship that we might say is like on the seminary level. And then there's the kind of discipleship, Jesus loves me, this I know, that you get to begin to pour into.
Yes.
And they're all the same. But again, discipleship is something that we can attach to something that we swim in every day, which is education. Whether we think back to our schooling or we're watching our kids going through those different grade levels. So here's something I want to just point out, and we need to unpack this in a second episode. I can already tell. I was looking at the clock, and wow. So here's what we'll start the conversation here, but this is where we're going to land in the next episode.
Okay.
The Northampton revival, where the first Great Awakening took place in the United States in 1735. One historian says this: "It broke upon the slumbering churches like a thunderbolt rushing out of a clear blue sky." I use that quote a lot when I'm talking with groups, with pastors, when I have an opportunity to speak at seminaries, which is not all the time, but if occasionally I get that opportunity. I've used that quote several times because I want us to be clear here. When we're talking about discipleship, it's something that every church should be a part of. I think the church is doing that really well. I think the average church, the average evangelical church today has had a pretty good, solid commitment to discipleship. Now, when I was in church as a young man, we had Sunday school in church, but to say that we had specific discipleship, we didn't. Did we have revival services every year?
Yes.
Sometimes 2 and 3 times a year. But did we have intentional discipleship beyond maybe training unions? Some of you will remember that in the old days. That was it. And yet here at Ridgecrest, I can tell you for the last 20 years, if you had your children at Ridgecrest all the way through, those kids were getting deep level discipleship in a way I didn't get when I was growing up. But when we start talking about revival, it is supernatural.
Right.
It is a thunderbolt out of a clear blue sky. Think of that analogy because it doesn't make sense.
Right.
Like we're not talking about something that is oh yeah, well, that looks like the kind of discipleship they're doing in Tennessee. What's the church in Tennessee that's doing all that stuff? The big he's this big, strong-looking dude. I can't believe it. I can't think. Long Hollow. There we go.
Oh, yeah.
Colby, you're just on fire today, man.
Robbie Gallaty.
Gallaty. Give this guy a microphone because he knows what he's talking about. But anyway, that's a kind of discipleship that people in the Southern Baptist Convention are talking about and have been for years. So we can look at that and say, okay, that's a particular kind. And we can look at, if we want to get old school Baptist, we could talk GAs and RAs and that kind of thing.
Mission friends,
right? Those are all discipleship things. But when we start talking about revival, we just kind of, we're getting into the realm of the Holy Spirit here.
I mean, we've taken now 23 minutes and really haven't talked revival. We've talked discipleship.
Yeah.
Because we don't know what it looks. I mean, we say we long for it, and we do, but it's like incomprehensible to us.
And this is something I hope that the people who watch this episode will bear with us and hear the second episode. This is so important. Oh, please hear us as I talk about revival historically. I do not want us to think that these are like stair steps or a prescription, as it were, to get to revival. I think that's the danger. I think that's what Ian Murray would warn us about if he were here with us. I think he would say, if you study revival for the purpose of like the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s of revival, you've missed the point. Revival is a thing of God, a move of God, a bolt of lightning out of a clear blue sky. Again, say it again, because it is a thing of God. And so we need to cry for something. We need to cry out for something that we simply cannot understand. And we need to know that when it shows up, there will be critics.
Right.
Every revival and we'll talk about this more later, but every revival had a very strong counter movement. Mm-hmm. And I'll also say this, there was within each revival that I'm thinking of right now, there were extremes that took place that marred the movement. Mm-hmm. So we could say, yeah, tens of thousands of people came to know Christ, but we could also say, yeah, and some crazy things happened too. Mm-hmm. Even the Jesus movement, if you watch the film, it's actually very, very, I think, balanced, because not only does it tell the story of this tremendous revival that took place among young people in California in the 1970s, but it shows that one of the main people that was involved in that kind of lost his way.
Okay.
That he went into some extremes and did not hold to good, solid biblical accountability. So the film, though it is from a really strong, I mean, it's not, sometimes non-believers will do films about Christians and to paint a bad picture. Mm-hmm. You can tell the people who put this together are trying to paint a good picture of what actually happened. But they're being accurate. They're saying, look how God used this person, and yet near the end he walked away from the accountability that had helped him really find what God was up to. Okay. But when he started to get too wrapped up into self and to his own desires, this particular person, so that's the movie, but
but we know how easy that is to do in our personal lives.
That's right. And again, we can go back in every age of the church and we can see similar things happening. So when we start talking about revival, I don't know, I want it so bad, but I want to be careful, because not only with the Asbury situation, but anytime there's like a stirring of the Spirit, someone's going to go run there. They're going to drive their car 8 hours. They're going to go there and claim on Facebook, this is the revival we've been looking for. And I saw that. And I have a couple people that I'm not super close with them, but I know them in ministry. And like every time there's one of these things, they're running towards that. They're so hungry for it. And I love that about them. But I feel like that sometimes they're willing to they just want it so bad that they may not be opening their eyes to the larger picture, because true revival cannot take part away from biblical Christianity. If the revival starts manifesting things that are extra biblical, that do not match with what we see in the book of Acts and in other scriptures, then we need to run away from that very quickly, because that could be demonic as opposed to the Spirit. Yeah.
So we're just down to just a few seconds left, but I do think this is absolutely worth just continuing that conversation. We had titled this "Revival Starts Small," and I'm excited as we unpack this in our second episode, really talking about those big revivals, but the revival that has to start in our heart, the quietness of our heart before we're ready for something big like that. Thank you again for joining us today. We'll see you next time on Hey Listen.